A very good evening to one and all. Yes. Yes, Meera.
Yes.
Okay. A very good evening to one and all. Every day is a new day. Today, today in this pleasant evening, myself, Dr. Janata, is here to take you to a new experience which will be enriching and enlightening. The 2 days sessions of this 7 days short-term program went on well with all your support and the resource person's wonderful resource lectures. Today I am so happy, so honored and privileged to greet you all to this 3rd day program with our eminent personality, moreover a simple down-to-earth human being with us, that is none other than Mr. T.P. Srinivasan G. Sir. Sir, welcome to this 3rd day program, sir.
Thank you.
So we always think that there are people who come into our lives and welcome a school breeze in the summer and lunch about as long. Such is the chief guest of today's program. That's what I believe, because T.P. Srinivasan sir is so familiar and he needs no introduction, because, and moreover, we feel that sir is a member of our own SAC family. A great person, a renowned person, a former ambassador and permanent representative of India to the United States, Vienna, and governor of the India of International Atomic Energy Agency. Sir has served in the Indian Foreign Service for 37 years. And of course, we believe that such a person who has risen in his life as an ambassador from our own nation, India, going around, trotting over the globe. This is the personality or the individuality who is right here to speak on the role of human rights in UN. Because the 20 years of experience of this great personality, representing a number of international conferences organized by the United Nations, Commonwealth, and the non-aligned movement, and also the person who chaired several UN committees and conferences, then we need who other than this great personality, this great honorable person, than for us today, here to enlighten the 3rd day program of the role of UN in human rights. Sir, we are humbled in front of you, sir, because we have heard a lot of talks about you, and also I was a part of my in the Kerala Academic Staff College. I listened to your lectures, and that were always inspiring and motivating. We, the SAC family, is so humbled, so grateful to you, sir. On behalf of IQAC and IIC and our own principal, I greet you here to this 3rd day session, sir. Now, I request our principal, Madam, Dr. K.V. Jayashree, to speak a few words about Srinivasan sir, because sir is the well-wisher of our college, who wants, who supports, motivates, inspires, always advises our college faculty and also student members to scale greater heights in their life. So it is our prime duty to felicitate and also to speak a few words about the today's great resource person, chief guest of ours. Madam, please. Principal Madam, over to you.
Yeah, all right. I was trying to see whether I get a better audio in the other, on the mobile phone. That doesn't work.
No, I was, yeah, Principal Ma'am is there.
Okay, it's all right. Follow the other one.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, before that I can ask. to Meera. Sorry, there's a little change. I just went on well. And I now request Dr. Meera to welcome Dr. Srinivasan Ji. Meera?
Yes.
Meera, please.
Yes. Madam Principal.
Meera?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah.
Respected Srinivasan sir, Madam
The audio is
Principal.
breaking. Okay, carry on. Dr. Meera, please.
Okay, Meera.
I think many people have
Good
switched.
evening.
The mics are on, that is why.
Today we have with us a very special guest, a most distinguished personality in international diplomacy. Was the permanent representative of our country in the United Nations between 1995 and 1995 to 97, and also served as the Governor of India in the International Atomic Energy Agency between 2000 and 2004. Apart from that, Sri Srinivasan has chaired and represented India in several committees and conferences of the United Nations, Commonwealth, and the Non-Aligned Movement. In his outstanding career as a diplomat, he has represented India in several nations, which include Austria, Slovenia, Kenya, South Pacific Island states, and the United States. In the initial years as an Indian diplomat, Sri Srinivasan has served in Japan, Bhutan, and also the erstwhile USSR. To all these glorious activities, he also has served as the Executive Director of IAEA 2020, as a member and advisor board of India, and also the Executive Director of Kerala Higher Education Council, and visiting professor to the Central University, Kerala. Sri Srinivasan sir is the author of 4 well-known books, several articles in the Asia Wall Street Journal, The Hindu, and Indian Express, etc. He has been honored with several awards, including the Harvey Memorial Prize, KP Menon Award, and Sri Chitra Tirunal National Award. It's a matter of pride for us in Sri Ayyappa College that Sri Srinivasan sir is currently the head of the Civil Service Academy of the NSS. Today, we are privileged to have an opportunity to listen to Sir's talk on role of UN in human rights. We are really honored and fortunate to have you, sir, as our chief guest for today's session. Most welcome to you, sir, for a short-term program on human rights. Welcome, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to place on a hearty welcome to Dr. GC HRDC, Kannur University. Welcome you, sir, in this session. Our hearty welcome to our Madam Principal, Dr. KV Jayasree, for the perfect logistic support she has extended to all of us. Welcome you, ma'am. Your goodwill, appreciation, continuous support, and positive vibration has a great impact and help us for the successful organization of the short-term program. Spring in my step, anticipation in my heart, I welcome Dr. Meena, IQAC Coordinator, IAC, Organizing Secretaries, Dr. Janata Kumari, Dr. Anita, and all IAC members to this session. I feel honored to welcome all the students of various institutions for taking a big part in this important topic. I'm sure that you all will knowledge after the talk. I welcome you and that all will have a good welcome you. Okay. Then
Audio is gone.
Mira.
Sorry.
Madam. Yes. Principal ma'am. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening to all distinguished panelists, T.P. Srinivasan sir, other dignitaries, faculty members, and participants. A cordial welcome to you all to the second session of the 7-day short-term program jointly organized by IAC of Sri Appa College for Women and UGC MHRD Kannur University. The second session of this 7-day short-term program focuses on the role of United Nations in human rights. Terrible massacre of human souls, large-scale destruction of private and national properties, and horror of the deadly scientific weapons during the First World War made the political thinkers of England, Germany, the USA, France, etc. for the establishment of an international organization for holding discussions on international problems. On June 1915, an organization called League to Enforce Peace was formed in America. However, after the conclusion of the war, the European statements felt the necessity of an international organization for the settlement of varied problems of the post-war world by peaceful means and through international. Hello, Mira. Hello.
We can hear you, ma'am. We can hear you.
There was a musical interlude. Somebody came through music. Okay.
Miss, unmute ചെയ്യണേ. Miss, please unmute your mic. We can hear you, ma'am.
So, however, after the conclusion of the war, the European statements felt the necessity of an international organization for the settlement of varied problems of the post-war world by peaceful means and through international cooperation, obviating the possibilities of war in future. The League of Nations was ultimately formed and it came into force in January 1920. The signatory states of the League Covenant pledged to maintain world peace and security through international cooperation instead of resorting to war. But due to the aggressive activities of Japan, Italy, and Germany, and the indifferent attitude of other big powers, the League of Nations became a defunct body. The big powers again reverted to the pre-war policy alliances and regional pacts. The Second World War, which brought the use of new types of destructive weapons, the vast scale of casualties and destruction of property had made the people all over the world anxious for peace and security, and they felt the necessity of establishing a well-organized and most powerful world organization. In 1943, the foreign ministers of Britain, USA, Russia, and China confirmed the necessity of forming a general international organization based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving nations for the preservation of international peace and security, and the United Nations Charter came into force on 24th October 1945. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, there was consensus among the participating member states at the San Francisco Conference that the maintenance of international peace and security was not possible without the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The United Nations Declaration is said to serve as an affirmation of faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women, while promoting the social progress and better standard of life. Tehran Conference, held at Tehran on 13th May 1968, invited UNESCO to develop a program aimed at making children aware from the time they start school of the respect for the dignity and the right of man, at making the principles of universal declaration prevail at all levels of education, particularly institutions of higher learning where the future cadres are trained. The UNESCO has made a lot of efforts in promoting human rights education through several of its instruments. It has approached the issue of education in a comprehensive manner by providing for the measures to be undertaken by teachers and others involved in education so to make it meaningful. Specific efforts have also been made to provide for education of different segments of the society throughout the conventions, particularly those relating to racial discrimination, women and children. The United Nations Human Rights Treaty bodies have played a key role in this development, in particular the Human Rights Committee and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Their work has had a direct impact worldwide, leading to changes in national law, policy and practices, as well as bringing redress to individual victims. Today, United Nations Human Rights Council provide voices to the voiceless who have been abused or silenced at the national level. We are really lucky as well as blessed to have Sri T.P. Srinivasan, IFS Director General, Kerala International Center and former Ambassador of India, Governor for India of the IAE, to share his vast knowledge on the topic with us. Sir, on behalf of the entire team of this program, I extend our gratitude for accepting our invitation as a panelist among your busy schedules. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, madam, for your kind introductory note and also greeting our resource, Srinivasan sir. Sir, our participants are eagerly waiting to listen to you, sir. So, please, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, distinguished principal, Dr. Meera, Dr. Janata, and all other guests. I see that 161 people have signed in, so that's not a bad audience. So,
172 now, sir.
all right, very good, very encouraging. So thank you for inviting me to discuss human rights. Because it's long since I think I've been asked to speak about human rights. These days we speak more about the global situation after COVID, education, new education policy, etc. So this is a good change that one has been asked to speak about the United Nations and the human rights. At the United Nations, at the moment, the emphasis is not on United Nations. UN is in a crisis. We are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN, but it is totally directionless after the COVID came about, and the United Nations totally failed to deal with that situation. They did not realize how significant this challenge was. And China, being the president of the Security Council at that time, blocked the UN from doing anything about this. And that has become a big discredit to the UN. So at the moment, we are battling with that idea whether the UN can be revived in order to remove this threat to peace and security. Because peace and security is not to be defined only as peace and war. The pandemic or this particular COVID-19 is the greatest threat to humanity. We do not even know how many of us will survive this. There is no idea as to where this would go. And today, success means simply survival. If you survive, you're successful. Nothing else is important. So that is the situation today. And so people have no time to think about other things or discuss other things in the UN. This is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. But at the same time, the life has to go on, and we have to think in terms of the various institutions that the UN has established. And we can hope that the UN will overcome this crisis and it will go back to its original responsibilities. This is by way of introduction. You all know that the United Nations was established. The principle went back to League of Nations. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with the United Nations only, because League of Nations was established after the First World War and it failed. And that is why the Second World War took place. And then after the Second World War, they created another international organization called the United Nations, removing all the weaknesses that the League of Nations had. So the main objective of the United Nations at that time was, in the words of the Charter, to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That was the objective. That is, we have had enough wars. There was nuclear weapons used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and people had enough of wars. So the winners of the World War got together and established the United Nations, and the others joined it. And because it was designed by the winners of the World War, they decided to perpetuate an organization dominated by them. That is why you have the permanent members, you have the veto, etc. So United Nations is not a democratic organization. It has its weaknesses. It is very loose organization because each country is sovereign, that's been accepted. And nobody has accepted the UN as an international or a world government. You must remember that. So naturally, the UN has many limitations. But over the last 75 years, it has done a lot of good work. But the main purpose of saving the succeeding generations from the scourge of war, they did not succeed. Because in the last 75 years, there have been no less than 800 wars in different parts of the world. But you can say there was no Third World War. So that is a credit that the UN can take. After the Second World War, the UN was established and there was no Third World War. So that is a matter of satisfaction. Whether the UN was responsible for that or not, we don't know. Anyway, that is not our topic. At that time itself, when the UN was established, it was clearly known that wars, etc., can be prevented only if there are some other areas are protected. And these areas which are important for peace have been identified. And what are these areas? Number one is economic, the world global economic order. So the UN has various agencies called specialized agencies and many committees and conferences looking after the economic life of the world. And in that, many resolutions have been passed. Even though all of it is not implemented, the UN has at least created a framework for economic cooperation among the countries. That's the second. And the third one was the social life of the world. You also have to look at the social order, how men behave, how the nations behave. Can there be a code of conduct for them? Can there be a code of conduct for countries? All that is not strictly permitted in the UN because one of the principles of the UN is that you shall not interfere in the internal affairs of the world, of other countries. So any question that you ask of a nation as the United Nations, the immediate return answer is, don't interfere in our internal affairs. That is what the Charter says. So the great challenge to the UN was, without interfering in the internal affairs of states, be a catalyst for protection and promotion of human rights. Human rights, suppose you all understand what it means. It means the right of every individual to have certain ability, certain possibility of exercising their fundamental human rights. Starting with, of course, political freedoms, economic freedoms, social freedoms. All these within the framework of the United Nations, but at the same time, within the framework and the cultural pattern of the countries concerned. Just to give an example, something which is acceptable in a certain country because of a certain religion may not be acceptable, the same principle may not be acceptable in another country with another religion. I don't need to give you examples. So when you deal with human rights, what is considered sacrosanct in Western countries may not be so sacrosanct in the Eastern countries or in Arab countries or in Latin America, etc. So a huge exercise was necessary to codify human rights which are generally acceptable to all. And that is the work that the UN developed first. Human rights include, as you all know, right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, right to work and education, and everyone is entitled to these rights without any discrimination. So these are the objectives. These are all the rights that human beings should have And these are to be determined by the governments they choose. So it is not for the United Nations to decide on the rules that are applicable to any country. The rules belong to their constitution, the idea that is acceptable to all of them. And then within that, or bringing them together, have to some kind of uniform standards are required. This is what the UN has done. Establish certain standards of behavior in all these rights that I mentioned, so that there is a benchmark, there is a yardstick by which you can measure the performance of other countries. And the first step that was done was the Declaration of Human Rights, which is an overarching umbrella under which what are called the Bill of Rights. There are several documents which were developed, which can be now collectively characterized as Bill of Rights of the United Nations, which people have accepted voluntarily. And what is the mechanism for this? The mechanism for this is someone brings in a proposal, say on freedom of expression, let us say, political freedoms in general. So the whole membership of the United Nations sits down and looks at a draft convention in which they outline the rights and the obligations of the government and a control system which is accepted by the governments concerned. So on the first hand, we have the Bill of Rights, that is the fundamental documents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the fundamental document. From that, we have gone on to develop various conventions, various treaties, and also various resolutions. There are some differences between all this, but the point I am trying to make, and which you must all note, is that these are voluntarily adopted by the member states. In no case can human rights be imposed on countries. But when you sign a convention or a covenant or a treaty or a resolution, these are all called in different forms in different areas. First, it is adopted by the United Nations General Assembly by a vote or by a consensus. And then each member state is invited to sign or accept that document. So you become a party to that convention. You become a party to that treaty. And once you become a party to that treaty, of course, before that, a lot of discussions take place in the General Assembly. Everybody puts on his own ideas, and that is how finally a declaration is made. And once that declaration is made, the countries have the right not to sign any of them. Right? So if you don't sign, what will happen is that the rest of the world will criticize you. They cannot do anything else. Like, for example, India has not signed a very famous treaty. I'm sure you all know. It's not in human rights, but the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Out of the 193 member states, only 3 have not signed. But India has stood firm that we will not sign this treaty because we see it as discriminatory between those who had nuclear weapons before 1968 and those outside that. So 190 countries of the world have accepted the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but since it is of a fundamental nature to us, we have not signed it. And the other 2 countries, our company is not very good. But the other 2 which have not signed are Pakistan and Israel, you can imagine. Not the very decent company. But we have similar concerns. Pakistan does not sign just because India does not sign. That's all. They have no other concerns. But Israel does not sign because they have a threat from the Arab countries, and therefore they are not willing to give up their right to use nuclear weapons. I'm just giving you an example of a treaty which may be acceptable to most of the countries, may be unacceptable to 1 or 2. And that is accepted, but they will keep on trying to bring you back into that, offering you new changes, new understanding, etc. And that's what happened in 2008 when we signed an agreement with the United States, which legitimized our position as a nuclear weapon power. Anyway, let's not go into that. So the first two major covenants or conventions which were signed was one on political rights and the other on economic and social rights. And most countries have signed, or some of them have signed with some reservations on some aspects. If you do not like something, you try to change it in the discussions, but everybody else agrees. And if you have a problem, you will just make a reservation. You will say that, yes, this treaty we accept, we sign, but we have a reservation on a particular clause or a particular paragraph of that. And if that doesn't contradict the spirit of the whole treaty, then that is acceptable. Again, I have to give you an example. The Covenant Convention on Political Rights, there is a definition of self-determination. In fact, the word self-determination appears in the Charter, which means that we all accept the principle of self-determination of people. But over a period of time, this has created problems for some of the bigger countries of the world, where small areas of certain countries have revolted against the original self-determination exercise. Because according to the definition of self-determination, that is exercised only once. So when you become independent, you can decide whether you want to be a secular state, or you want a religious state, or you want to contain, say, some kind of liberties, etc. You are a communist state, you have your own. You can do all that. Even if you do all that, you must maintain the frame of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, and there should not be any violation. So the thing that we do is, if there is a particular issue like self-determination I was mentioning, we have a particular problem here because Pakistan claims that the people of Kashmir have not exercised their self-determination, in the sense that no referendum was held before Kashmir joined India. And this sounds very convincing to everybody. But what we people don't remember is that all other states, including Travancore states and Hyderabad and various other states, joined the Republic of India or the Union of India after certain discussion and understanding, etc. You might remember, all of you, that Maharaja of Travancore at one time thought that he could become an independent country. He was told by C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer that, with the wealth that we have of all the herbs and the pepper and everything and titanium and so many resources we have, Travancore can remain an independent country. It attracted the Maharaja for a little while. But then he immediately realized that it will be stupid for Travancore to remain independent. And the people of Kerala, many of them, particularly the Congress party and others, also did not want any free Travancore. And so C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer's nose was cut off and he went away, and Travancore joined the Union of India. And after that, on that particular time, we could have exercised it. But once you have joined, you cannot ask for another self-determination exercise. This has happened in many countries. People have said, no, that was a mistake, so we want to be independent. There are so many countries which have become independent after the original decolonization. In our case, our position is that self-determination is applicable only to countries under foreign occupation. This is our definition. But the Charter doesn't say that. The Charter says all people have the right to self-determination. If you say that, tomorrow any state in our country can say that we want another self-determination exercise, we want to break off. There are states, Nagaland and those areas also, there are tendencies to break away from India. So we cannot accept that. So when we signed the Covenant of Political Rights, we accepted everything in those covenants. That is freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom even of conversion. All this we have accepted. But after signing it, we entered a reservation saying that in our opinion, self-determination applies only to countries under foreign occupation or domination. And this is a very special Indian position. Similarly, others have other opinions. Even the United States have made many reservations. Other countries have made many reservations. But then the UN will look at it. Whatever reservation that you make, the UN will see whether this particular reservation that you have made affects the overall convention. Like we say, whether you can make an amendment to the Constitution, but the limitation is that amendment should not alter the character of the Constitution. We all know that. The fundamental rights cannot be changed, but others can be changed. So, in every Convention on Human Rights and fundamental freedoms, and also individual human rights, we have broad agreement on these conventions, and there are many countries which have reservations on that. Of course, as far as the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is concerned, that outlines what kind of rights we have, like standards of women, rights of women, children, persons with disabilities, minorities, other vulnerable groups, etc. And then in the economic and social and cultural rights, there are elements against racial discrimination, against various social discrimination or economic discrimination, etc. So these two, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, are the two big branches, and under each of these we have different conventions as required. I hope that is understood. So overall you have a framework of the United Nations, which is the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Then under that you have two covenants, one on cultural and political rights, civil and political rights, and the other on economic, social, and cultural rights. And under that, there are various conventions on the rights of the child, on the status of women, on torture, how torture has to be prohibited, how child labor has to be prohibited. There are so many elements in all this, and all these put together, the United Nations have set the standards of behavior of countries. This is what you have to know. So we are not as free as we think. We are not as sovereign as you think. The United Nations does impose certain standards of behavior on us, not by compulsion, because you can always leave the convention. If you feel that the UN is putting too much pressure on you, you can walk out of it. It's not difficult. So it is voluntary. It is because we all feel that these constraints will help human rights as a whole. But this whole architecture of human rights got into serious trouble soon after the United Nations was established. Why? Because of the Cold War. Because when the Cold War started between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, they fought the war together. Soviet Union and United States was on one side. But now they became on two sides. And so this whole idea of the United Nations helping the humanity became an illusion, because they turned themselves into two groups and started fighting with each other, what is called a Cold War. There was no war, but there was a Cold War. And therefore, the application of human rights became difficult because every issue was divided between the two of them. At that time, what happened was human rights was considered a stick to beat the communists. So when the communists did anything in the Eastern Bloc, the Westerners will say, where are the human rights? And they say, we don't care about that. And therefore, implementing human rights or supervising human rights was not efficient or effective in this whole period from 1945 to 1990. So it was only after the Cold War ended and we become from a bipolar world, we became a unipolar world with the United States as the leader. That is when the human rights instruments, as they are called, became effective. Otherwise, since neither of them agreed, nothing was possible. There were exceptions. Like, for example, the apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa was the biggest violation of human rights. To call the majority of the people of that country illegal or discriminatory, then that is the biggest violation of human rights. And India was the first one to raise this issue in the UN in the 50s. And the first attack came from all the Western countries against India, saying you are violating the principle of the Charter. You are not supposed to interfere in the internal affairs of South Africa. And most Western countries insisted on that. But we got the support of the communist countries because they had nothing to lose. They had no racial discrimination. So the non-aligned countries as a whole, we are about 111 countries, plus the East European countries, joined together to launch this big campaign against apartheid in South Africa. Still, it continued till 1994. You know, Nelson Mandela was in jail for 24 years. And the UN could not help him because the permanent members like United States, UK, and France would veto any decision of the Security Council on giving freedom to Nelson Mandela or to make South Africa a democracy. So, but we fought it very hard. And that is why the definition of internal matter changed. Because if it is a threat to the life and lives and livelihoods of people in a country, then that government cannot say, no, this is our country, so you cannot ask questions. So this Lakshman Rekha of internal matters was broken by India. India was the first country in the world to challenge that. And now it is accepted that any massive and systematic violation of human rights, there is a further definition. If there is 2 people arrested or 3 people jailed, then the United Nations doesn't do anything. But if the United Nations comes to notice a massive violation and systematic violation of human rights on the basis of discrimination, the United Nations feels that they have a responsibility to intervene. This must be understood. And that is why you hear when something happens in India, when the Article 370 came about or the citizenship law came about, etc. Those who oppose these measures, their idea is to create so much confusion in the country so that foreign countries and the United Nations take note of it and they want to make them interpret it as systematic violation of human rights. It has not happened till today, but it can happen if the internal situation becomes extremely difficult. And then the UN has a responsibility to intervene. And that is why internal disturbances have an impact on external policies. Okay, we will not go into that. That's not part of human rights. I just mentioned it because there is this exception started by us. India started that. That if it is systematic and massive violation of human rights, then the UN will intervene or can intervene. So we have signed most of these conventions. India has a fairly good record. United States has not signed many of these conventions. But as I mentioned in the case of self-determination, we have had some problems with some of the human rights conventions. One is the self-determination, the fundamentally. Then some strange problems came up for us. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Everybody was shocked and surprised that India did not sign this convention. It was a shock to everybody. Why did India not sign rights of the child? What is your problem? And 25 years we fought that. We did not sign. You know why? Because according to the Rights of the Child Convention, no child below the age of 14 can go to work. You know the situation in India. We simply cannot say that. Because here, every child has to earn its living in the villages. They have to work in the farms. You cannot say till the age of 14 you should not work in the fields. They go on holidays. On weekends, they go to a match factory in Shivakashi and make some money. Or they go to carpet factories and make some money that contribute to the family's income. So for India to ban all child labor below the age of 14 was unreasonable and unrealistic because of our social situation. So, but we were under tremendous pressure to sign it. I remember every delegation which came to Delhi to meet the Prime Minister, first question they'll say, Your Excellency, why are you not signing the Rights of the Child Convention? And most Prime Ministers will not know. So they'll turn to us and say, what is this? What are they saying? Why aren't we signing this? Then you have to sit down and tell the Prime Minister in his ears, this is because of the rights of the child and the child labor. But now finally we have signed it on one condition, that we will implement it in stages. So we are committed to outlaw child labor, but we have been given some years to slowly eliminate it rather than create a social revolution by banning child labor in India. Another problem we had with the rights of women. The rights of women was a technical problem because in our constitution, the nationality of the child is that of the father. The mother's nationality has no role. But in the in the Status of Women Convention, both can be. The child has the option to take either the father's nationality or the mother's nationality. Which means we have to change our law. This is the problem. When you sign an international convention, the international convention takes precedence over our national law. Therefore, we need to change our national law. You cannot remain in contradiction with the international law. And that is why we signed the convention after a long time, because the process of changing the constitution and making the law takes time. And therefore, we signed it recently, not in the beginning. And then one last convention which we have not signed even today is what is called the Convention Against Torture. We know that our policemen torture everybody, whether you are a criminal or not. They take criminals, they make criminals by torturing them. That is the system we have. And that is well known. People know that Indian police does that. So you cannot hide it. How do you eliminate it? Even today, we have not eliminated it. So if you go and sign a convention saying that torture shall not be used against a criminal, then we will be violating the international law. So we did not sign it for a long time. And finally, we have signed it now. saying that there is a provision in the Convention Against Torture about mental torture, that you shall not, impose mental torture on people. But what is mental torture? We don't know. And therefore, Government of India has made a reservation that on this we cannot commit because we don't know what mental torture is. But our legal authorities, our law and order authorities will certainly try and make sure that torture is not used. But in spite of all that, it goes on, and our policemen don't even know that there is a convention against torture. I don't think they are educated in any particular manner. They even kill people. And we have committed to the international community that will not even torture a person, will not even beat somebody in order to prove a case. So these are some of the problems that we have in accepting the UN human rights. And similarly, there are problems for everybody else. So what does the UN do? UN has various stages of helping the countries to implement these resolutions. So they have various institutions. One is a convention. When a convention is signed, there is a committee of the parties who have signed the convention. They sit together and look at the complaints they have received from various countries. Because if you feel that the Government of India is violating your human rights, you have every right to approach the Human Rights Council. It's called Human Rights Council. Through various agencies. You have heard about the Amnesty International that we threw from here. Like that, there are very famous international organizations, non-governmental organizations, which keep a watch on the behavior of countries. So an Indian individual, suppose he goes and complains to the Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, what they will do is they will conduct their own investigations. They will go to the villages because they are allowed to at the moment. But of course, Amnesty is now withdrawn because we are not allowing them to operate. And then they will submit a report to the concerned UN organizations or the conventions. And then they ask you a question. You get hundreds of letters, both in New York and Geneva, from the United Nations saying that we heard that when Mr. Singh was arrested in some Chandigarh village or somewhere, and he is still in jail for 3 years. What is your answer? What do I know? So I go back, I write to my Ministry of External Affairs, they will write to the Home Affairs Ministry, they will write to the Punjab government will ask the district will go to the village and finally find Mr. Singh and see what is his problem. Either he may have died by then, or he may have disappeared, or he may have no complaint anymore. You never know. But then you have to go back all the way into the human rights institutions to prove our bona fides. No, such a man probably was arrested because he stole a chicken or something, and he was freed after 3 days, but you are so showing it as the 20 years is all wrong, and so we clarify. So there is an opportunity like that, and that is what these committees do. They examine complaints, and they also expect you every year to send a report for each of these bodies, how you have implemented the conventions. And that is also examined by the committees concerned. And all these committees will go to the main body, which is called the Human Rights Council. It used to be Human Rights Commission till a few years ago, till early 90s. And the name was changed because the Americans wanted to give more powers to the council, and it was a commission, it was not very powerful. But they did not succeed. The majority of the people of the world were not willing to give the Human Rights Commission any more authority. What the Americans wanted was to make the Human Rights Commission like a Security Council, which can take action. Security Council can take action. But nobody was willing. Americans fought very hard, and finally they voted against their own resolutions. It was a very funny thing. And they walked out of the Human Rights Council because they could not get what they wanted. Anyway, that's a side story. So now what we have is the Human Rights Council. And in 1993, we also established the post of a human rights commissioner, like the Secretary General for the UN. Now we have a human rights commissioner who is responsible for the human rights institutions inside the UN, and this is located in Geneva. And he is the executive officer of the Human Rights Council. And what does the Human Rights Council do? When all these things are filtered through so many agencies and organizations and all that, in spite of all that, some become so serious that they need attention. Like, for example, suppose you don't like a country, Iran, you don't like. So some of these countries study all the complaints received from Iran and make it into a huge case and make a resolution in the council. They will say, we have noticed A, B, C, D, and therefore Iran must be criticized, Iran must be thrown out of the United Nations. All these arguments they make. Not that anybody will agree to that. So what the Human Rights Council will then do, they will send a special representative to that country. That's the first action. Okay, if a country is accused of violating human rights, then the Human Rights Commissioner will appoint a reputed gentleman belonging to some other country and ask him to go to Iran, talk to those people, and see whether you can resolve it. So he comes back and makes a report. Suppose he says, now everything is okay, it's fine. But no, many cases, it goes beyond that. And there is normally a big fight in the council and a vote is taken. Many countries will say Iran is useless and we must criticize them. And Iran's friends will say, no, Iran is very dignified and good, etc., etc. And therefore, normally such resolutions are not adopted because they give explanations and all that. But there are always cases, in the case of several countries, where this is beyond that. And Cuba was the favorite of everybody to criticize. So every year there was a resolution against Cuba. Every year there used to be a resolution about China, against Yugoslav republics, against East European countries. So many of these things happen, and therefore the Human Rights Council is a very interesting place. You hear about all kinds of misdemeanor, misbehavior by states. And this is what we have to remember. They look only at the human rights violation of the states, not of individuals. See, whenever this accusation comes against us in Kashmir, what we point out to the United Nations is, you are barking against the wrong tree. In Kashmir, what is happening is, violation of human rights is committed by individual people, not the government. What the government is trying to do is to keep law and order. In the process, we may have to arrest people, some of them may be killed, but we have to maintain law and order. Why don't you look at that? But they say, no, we have no mandate to look at that. Our responsibility is look at you as the government. Are you making any violation of human rights? So India has been lucky. We have not had any resolution against us, except once. In 1995, I think, the first time they moved a resolution against India for human rights violations in Kashmir. And I must say there was a lot of sympathy for Pakistan at that time, because the cases that they produced in front of the council were quite solid, because the situation was so bad and many people had to be killed, many people were jailed and so on. And there was a big pressure on us to allow it to be put to a vote. So initially we tried not to allow it to put to a vote. We go and talk to each country. I remember traveling the whole of Latin America at that time. Countries which we had not even talked about before, going and telling them all about the story, because they don't know many details. But sometimes when they say, oh, is there so much violation, so let us vote against India. But we transformed it, we changed it. We told everybody what Pakistan was up to, that this is a political gimmick by them, and therefore it should be rejected. And it was very close, and it was very tense. Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee led the Indian delegation. He was the leader of the opposition, and together with the Minister of State for External Affairs, both of them went to Geneva and argued it out, spoke to our friends, etc. Until the last moment, we were not sure whether this will be adopted or not. If that resolution was adopted, it would have been a big blow to us, and it would have been a big victory for Pakistan. But the day of the vote, we worked for about 2 months on this issue. But the day of the vote, lo and behold, Iran came and requested Pakistan to withdraw the resolution. It was very dramatic. We did not know who Iran was going to support, but they came out with this dramatic request to Pakistan to withdraw this resolution because it would have ended up in a war between India and Pakistan, no less. And thank God the resolution was withdrawn. Of course, Iran takes the credit for it, and Pakistan says we agreed, etc., etc. But they also were not sure they'll win. If they knew they would win, they would have still pressed it to a vote. But they didn't want to lose. And we were not very sure that we will win, so we did not say, no, don't withdraw. We could not say that also. That is the only occasion when India was dragged onto the council saying that it's a violator of human rights. But Cuba, China, Iran, sometimes Indonesia, many religious states are brought to the council, and different kinds of punishment. The first punishment is to send somebody investigate, and then suppose they say, oh, our policemen don't know much about human rights. They'll say, okay, we will teach the policemen. They'll organize a conference for police officers, teach them what to do, give them the law, tell them how to implement it, how to take care, etc., etc. So you give them assistance. Then if that doesn't work, you criticize them. If that doesn't work, they can even be thrown out of the Human Rights Council. And that has happened in the case of Libya. They said, we want to throw them out of the council. So these are all drama. But essentially what we have to remember is, as far as human rights are concerned, UN's best contribution is the standardization of human rights. When you say you should not arrest a person, in what conditions can you arrest him? In what conditions you cannot arrest him? All these are laid out in this. And so any respectable nation, when you sign a convention, you will certainly implement it. And therefore, the protection and promotion of human rights, UN has played a big role. But I would not say it was an innocent role. It was a very much a political role. It divided the world into different groups, and it politicized and accused several countries and used it to create problems for them. China was under tremendous pressure. Now not, because now China has many friends all around the world. But many occasions China was criticized, Cuba was criticized, Iran was criticized. And so overall, UN has managed to hold up a model and say, this is what you have to follow. And that is the contribution that UN has made. So any question arising on human rights issues anywhere in the world, first of all, there is a law to deal with it. So if somebody is accused of something, you know that according to that particular law, this country is wrong or right. And that's a very great help for us, the governments. Similarly, it's a big threat because you can be dragged to the Human Rights Council and criticized. And for a country like India, to be criticized for human rights is a big problem. In fact, during the Article 370 agitations, the Human Rights Commissioner made a lot of noise. She said that India is violating blah, blah, blah. She's a Chilean woman. She was not particularly fond of India. But on her own personal responsibility, she said all kinds of things. Finally, she stopped. Because we went to her and talked to her and put pressure on her and all that. And that is a continuing thing. So this happens to everybody. But since UN has codified these laws, standardized behavior, this much you should remember. What is UN's contribution? UN's contribution is to identify the standards of behavior in every activity of human rights, number one. Secondly, the UN has assisted the countries concerned to follow these rules. Third, UN has given facilities, training facilities for people to improve their situation. And finally, they have the right also to punish you in extreme circumstances. So as a result of these measures, that the UN has taken. Human rights have been promoted and protected, I would say, about 90% of the time, and which is an accomplishment. I mean, the record on, prohibition of war has not been so successful. But in promotion and protecting human rights, UN has played an important role, and it should continue even if this United Nations goes and another one comes, because there's a lot of criticism about the UN's irresponsible behavior during the pandemic, during the COVID, because they did nothing. WHO says various things, but the UN as a whole did not take any action. And so there is a big demand for the UN to be reorganized. But as far as the human rights element of the UN, we can say that it has been a success story. I can stop here, and then if there are questions and if there is time, I shall be too happy to answer. Thank you very much.
That's now,
Vinitha is
yes. So it's an excellent lecture, sir. So I shall move on to the question and then I will conclude this, sir. Shall I take some questions, sir?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir. The question is from one Viresh CM. Why political difference for ablation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir? Why political difference for ablation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir?
Well, that is a political question. What we are discussing is human rights. What they are concerned about is, whatever may be the political reason, if there is violence and if there is protest, how does the government deal with it? That's all that the UN is concerned about. They are not bothered about 370. You understand? So the political issue is something else. But in the process of protesting against government action, are human rights being violated by the government? That is the question that they examine. They don't go into the substance. So they keep saying, why should there be violence? So you must have done something wrong. So you withdraw so that there is peace. That is how they look at it. Of course, the political argument you already know, I hope, but that's not within our topic. The point is whether Article 370 should be there for all time to come. It was a temporary measure. How can one state in India have different laws? That's what's happening. Even the chief minister was all called prime minister initially. And they were supposed to have autonomy. And as a result, increasingly there was demand for azadi, different demand for freedom. And all that happened because Pandit Nehru, at that time of independence, gave them this assurance that we will not destroy the Kashmir culture, the Kashmiriyat. So in order to protect Kashmir's identity, we made several rules. Like others, we cannot go and buy land in Kashmir. We cannot go and invest in Kashmir. So Kashmir is like a foreign country. And this was supposed to be only for a few years. It has gone on for 74 years. That was unacceptable. And so after discussion in Parliament, it was decided that 370 will be taken off. But that affected the people who wanted freedom. The minority of people in Kashmir who wanted to break away and join Pakistan, it hurt their interests. So that is why they made all this noise. And they had to be arrested, put in jail, no internet, so many restrictions. And then the UN gets very agitated. This is violation of human rights. So that is the issue. We must separate the political issue from the human rights issue. Okay?
Sir, I
Another
have
question from Mr. Sudhir Gopal. So what factors do prevent India from becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Has it came to your notice of a recent trend in accusing the Nehruvian policies for each such thing, every such thing without considering the political realities of the initial periods of that period? How far such criticism is justified?
What is the criticism? I didn't hear that part.
Has it came to your notice of a recent trend in accusing the Nehruvian policies for every such thing without considering the political realities of the initial periods of that period?
No, but what is the accusation? It is true that we have not become a permanent member.
Becoming a permanent member of UN Security Council.
No, I know the question I understood, but there was something about criticism or something. But what I'll explain, of course, again, this is not within our topic today, because there is a proposal since 1979. That was the first year I went to the United Nations. We proposed that the Security Council should be expanded from 15 to 20 or whatever, and have new permanent members in the Security Council. After 40 years, nothing has happened till today. The reason is the 5 permanent members have to agree. And why should they agree? They have the right to veto anything that you want to change the charter. Why should anybody accept that they share their power with somebody else? That is the reason, simple as that. And also the majority of the member countries do not want more permanent members. We want to be a permanent member. Germany wants, Japan wants, many other countries also want. But those who have no chance of becoming a permanent member, why should they make you permanent member? Because to do anything in the charter, you need 2/3 majority of the General Assembly and 5 positive votes of the permanent members. This can never happen. You may have a claim, you may have a right. In fact, the Prime Minister spoke very strongly in the General Assembly this time. He said, how long do we want to wait to keep 1/3 of the population of the world outside the Security Council? This is what he said. China is already there. We are the 2nd largest country. How can you exclude us? Yes, but they don't want you, because that means instead of 5 countries imposing veto, 6 countries or 7 countries or 10 countries will veto. And that is not acceptable to the rest of the. So it's not against India. Nothing against India. But the structure itself cannot be changed because the majority of the people in the General Assembly do not want it. And the permanent members don't want it, of course. So that is the situation. It has nothing to do with human rights.
One more question from Dheeraj. Dheeraj, I couldn't pronounce that name, Ambade. Can UN intervene in the matter of caste-based genocide in India? Can UN intervene in the matter of caste-based genocide in India?
Is there caste-based genocide? I have not heard about it. If there is, UN can interfere. There is no problem. But first you have to explain what does genocide mean? Genocide means that you destroy a particular group. That is genocide. Is there any case in India that a whole community is killed because they belong to a particular community? Never heard of that. There may be complaints, one issue here, one issue there, maybe 10 issues now of violation of human rights, rape cases, this, that, and the other. But that is not genocide. There is no caste-based genocide here. Of course, there was caste-based expulsion. All the Pandits of Jammu and Kashmir were thrown out of Jammu and Kashmir. Even that is not genocide. That was just exiling a particular community. And even now they have not gone back. So it is not against Dalits, it is not against the lower class, it is against the Brahmins of Jammu and Kashmir. It has happened. But caste-based genocide, never heard of it. It has happened in other countries and UN has intervened. Like in Yugoslavia. Muslims were killed left, right and center. And finally they had to create a Muslim state. So caste-based genocide is not there in India. Never.
Again, a couple of questions. Can I, sir?
Yes, please.
Yes. Again, there is one more question from Sudhir Gopal. The working of organizations like Amnesty, Greenpeace, etc. are inviting criticism from some governments. What is the approach of the UN towards NGOs?
Well, UN entertains all NGOs. No problem. NGOs can. Amnesty is one of the most prominent NGOs. And there is a system by which these NGOs can be observer in the UN. There are hundreds of them, various kinds of NGOs. But there are respectable ones and not so respectable ones. Some of them join simply to promote one case or one cause or one person or something like that. But established NGOs like Amnesty are highly respected. Their reports are considered, and the states have to answer. But our constant complaint about Amnesty is that they are investigating only the governments. They must look at Lashkar-e-Toiba. What are they doing? Are they not violating human rights in Kashmir? So to focus only on the government, which has the responsibility to protect law and order, is unfair. But still we answer them. But Mrs. Gandhi had thrown them out of India some years ago when she was Prime Minister, because she was fed up of this, their interference in everything that we do. So she threw them out completely. And it was much later, when Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Foreign Minister, that we brought them back. So there are a lot of international criticism when we threw them out. Just like now that Amnesty has stopped saying that they are being harassed, there is a lot of criticism from other countries because they are so respectable. But we have problems because they have been encouraging, certain movements in the country. They were misusing their funding. They're funding some kind of unrest in some areas. And obviously, we have clamped down on foreign funding of these agencies. And that is what they didn't like, because they stopped the bank accounts of Amnesty International. And so they just left because they couldn't survive here. And we will see. They have to negotiate with us, establish a code of conduct. But they don't have a code of conduct. UN has not established a code of conduct for NGOs. But there is a code of conduct for countries. And so we are criticized while they are not. So in future, I'm sure we will have discussions with Amnesty. And if they agree to a code of conduct, I'm sure we'll allow them in. Because it is good for us also to know what is happening in human rights violations in the country. Because the government may not know certain things, and that will be helpful. But not on their terms. It has to be on our terms.
So one more question, sir.
Yes.
Bharat Jignesh, any action taken for prevention? Is there any action taken by the UN for the prevention of human rights violation in China?
In where? In China?
I think they are thinking of, or they meant that coronavirus, that may be COVID-19, all this pandemic and everything related to that, I think. Is there any action taken for prevention of human rights violation in China by UN?
Yes, the UN, yes. There have been many, many resolutions. Of course, nothing was passed because the Chinese have a lot of friends, so resolutions are not adopted. But China's human rights record is very bad, and it is criticized, and they have tried to, restrain themselves from violation of human rights. Now it is much better, but not, of course, always the best, because the system is such. In a communist country, human rights are not considered sacrosanct. They believe in a little bit of bloodshed if necessary. And in such countries, naturally, there will be a lot of problems. When you are a dissident in China, you don't know when you will disappear. So dissidence is permitted to some extent. People can write articles. But then if they find that you are going beyond the limits, they just eliminate you. And so the UN, the Human Rights Council, protest and make a lot of noise, and China will get reformed, or at least they will say that this will not happen. And that goes on all the time. There have been many instances where the Human Rights Council has intervened in China. But still they continue to do what they think is right, because it's a totalitarian country. It's not a democratic country. But in a democratic country, it is not only the government that reads these reports. Ordinary people can read and react. And that's not possible in China. And therefore, UN has to intervene. But China is so powerful and so strong that we cannot force them to do anything. But we can advise them, tempt them with this and that in order to reform their country. But their system is such. And wherever such systems exist, they will defend it. If suppose it's a religious country, they will say this religion is final here. Suppose some women complain that they are not allowed to do A, B, C, D. that they can do elsewhere. You cannot drive a car, you cannot do this, that, and the other. You can say it is discrimination. But then the government will say this is religious law here. Our laws are different from yours. And unless they themselves change the law, there's nothing that we can do.
Meera, please ask Meera.
Sir, it was really an enriching talk, sir. Thank you so much for your great presence and lecture. I have one question, sir. What step the UN is empowered to take to prevent racial and religious discrimination, such as those faced by Rohingyas in Burma, Tamilians in Sri Lanka, and Ahmadis in Pakistan?
Yes, but remember, as I told you right from the beginning, one of the basic principles of the UN is that you will not interfere in the internal affairs of other states. Okay, that you must remember. It's fundamental. But there are exceptions. I explained all that. It is a systematic, massive violation of human rights, killing of people, so many complaints. Then only UN will act. For a small thing or a small discrimination against somebody is not allowed to get into a shop or some restrictions of that kind. The UN cannot do anything because it's an internal. But when it becomes serious, when it becomes a challenge to human rights of the whole country, and then the UN can. That's why I said there is a provision now for responsibility to protect. There is a law according to which actually you can go and interfere. But again, India was the one who showed the model. You may have heard some years ago that we dropped food packets over Jaffna in Sri Lanka. I don't know if you remember that. It was a violation of the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. But we did it because we thought that the Tamils were being starved. So they went to the UN and complained that we intervened. But finally, the world accepted it because it was a humanitarian intervention. Then later we sent our peacekeeping force into Sri Lanka. That was at the invitation of the Sri Lankan government. That you can do. In Myanmar, the problem is of Rohingya. It can become a very serious problem. And this lady Aung San Suu Kyi was the most respected leader of the opposition in Myanmar. Now stands criticized. A Nobel Prize. People want to take the Nobel Prize away because she is siding with the army to throw out the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas were originally from Bangladesh. And they had settled in Burma for many, many years. But they have been thrown out. Some of them came to India. And we supported the Myanmar government that they should go back to their countries. Because there was some trouble, some terrorist problems they were involved. And they were Muslims because the majority are Buddhists there. And as a result of that, we supported the Myanmar government in trying to send them back to Bangladesh. Therefore, we had problems with Bangladesh also. So there are these instances where the UN, as I said, humanitarian intervention is permitted. And the word is R2P. R2P means responsibility to protect. And that is one of the international laws. You can do that, but there is a standard for all that. You cannot say I have responsibility to protect somebody in Kerala because he is not able to go to the temple, something like that. Such small things you cannot intervene. But if there is a huge violation of human rights, systematic, then the UN can intervene.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Anything else?
I welcome Dr. Anita for the vote of thanks.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Meera?
yes.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasant duty to propose vote of thanks. On behalf of Sri Ayyappa College and the entire fraternity of the institution, first of all, I extend my most sincere thanks to the Almighty God for making today's event a resounding success. Today, we have got the eminent personality, T.P. Srinivasan sir, who has given a clear picture about the human rights in all aspects, not only in one particular area, but the whole world. Today, we have faced number of human violations that was clearly clarified by Srinivasan sir with his great experience to us. Sir, once again, thanks wholeheartedly on behalf of Sri Ayyappa College, IQAC and IIC team and UGC HRDC, Kannur University. I would like to express our profound gratitude to UGC HRDC Director, Dr. Sridharan Sir, and our beloved Principal, Dr. Jayasri Ma'am, and IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Meena Ma'am, for giving guidance and support in this program. I am immensely thankful to Dr. Janta Kumari for her efforts towards anchoring us today. His own ideas and elegance of explanation of everything. I need to mention my deepest sense of appreciation. Following my gratitude to Dr. Meera for gracing the occasion and sharing her welcome address. I also extend thanks to all the team members of IIC and the technical supporters for their enormous cooperation of this program. Last but not least, a big thank you to each one of the participants and others who made this program in a successful manner. On behalf of my team, let me thank all. Thank you, Anandal.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Well,
you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking
sir.
to you. Of course, it would have been better if we were in a hall talking to each other face to face. That would have made a big difference. But unfortunately, that is not possible. And this is the second best. So for a speaker, you have to know the response of the audience. Then only you are inspired to speak. So now I'm training myself to speak to a screen, which is not very easy. But since normalcy returns, I suppose we have to do things in this manner, and this is the least we can do to keep the conversation open. We must all have the opportunity to express our views.
Sir, I am back.
Thank you very much.
Sir, I am back, sir. Sir, I am back, sir. 1 minute. 1 minute, sir.
Yes.
Sir, somehow I don't know, somehow I lost my connection. I am back. Very sorry, sir, because of this network connection, sir. I wanted to tell you one thing, that is the information, the incidents and the events and the UN's, I have to sum up what you have spoken, sir. Catalyst of protection, promotion of HR, principles of UN, challenge of UN, fundamental rights, and how you were telling that how India was supporting South Africa during the apartheid discrimination, and later on the whole that how UN plays a dominant role in protecting human rights. That was really an enriching session, sir. Because if I didn't say this, I was very well listening to you. That was a comfortable and enriching, enlightening, informative session, sir. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. This was my job for 20 years. So.
Yeah, that was coming like, no, it's so
I'm not talking from a textbook.
Yeah, you just spontaneously coming from your, that's what I was telling. It's coming like that.
My textbook.
Yes, sir.
I can go on for hours.
That's what I was
seen of the UN.
One after the other, it was coming like that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, sir. And dear participants, one